And 92 people there.
I'll say right now.
Where's Alice?
Am I on?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
hello, everybody. All right. I hope all of you that are here enjoyed the Radcliffe fight song. Thank you, Bob and Winnie Blacklow, for sending me the audio and the lyrics. Okay, next slide. I'm happy to welcome all of you today. Class of 66, our 55th reunion class, the Crimson Society, all reunion classes, alumni, and friends. I'm so glad that you are here. And I hope you've all been enjoying Radcliffe Day. What an excellent day to talk about Radcliffe alumni. This afternoon, 4 of us from the class of 1966 are here to tell you about the Radcliffe College Alumni Oral History Project, sponsored by the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco. I'm Alice Barbanel, the project director of the project. And let me introduce Julie Cheever. Are you up? Is Julie up on the thing to wave? Hello, Julie. There's Julie, who was on the original committee from the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco. And Connie Gibb, somewhere. Where are you?
Hello.
And Diane Franklin, 2 of our interviews. That's Connie and Diane somewhere, wherever you are. There's Diane. Great. There is a whole network of people who are supporting our project, and I wanted to name a few. First of all, the amazing alumni we have interviewed. The women of the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco, our project sponsor. And our volunteer alumni interviews are the backbone of our project, along with Connie and Diane. On the panel today, I want to thank Susie Underwood, class of 72, and a big shout out to Joy Horowitz, class of 75, who was one of our very first interviewers. I hope that you're both here today. And there are 3 others who helped us get started. Joan McIver, she lives in the UK, and Judy Dror, both from the great class of 1975, and our most recent alum, Margaret Wying, from the class of 2012. And finally, thank you to the many, many alumni and friends who have contributed time and funding to make this project possible. And behind the scenes, we have Kim Delahunty and Liz Ornstein. Kim will be monitoring the chat, and thank you, both of you. And please, any questions or comments in the chat. Kim will collect the questions and we'll share them for Q&A after we present. So today we're going to start with some Radcliffe College history and some oral history project history. Okay, this is an image, what we call her the Radcliffe girl, is of a sport costume that was worn until 1914. Although, of course, it was adopted from an earlier era than our oral history project, we have adopted it as an emblem for the project. Just like in the fight song, she's swinging her banner proudly. And I'm just going to say a few words about the history of women at Harvard. To quote Helen Horowitz, an historian who in 2012 gave a Radcliffe Institute lecture about this, she said, "It's complicated." I'm going to spotlight just a few turning points. Probably most of you know there were no women students at Harvard from the university's founding in 1636 until 1879. That's 243 years. when Elizabeth Cary Agassiz and others established what was called the Society for the Collegiate Instruction of Women, nicknamed the Harvard Annex. I want you all to remember that name, the Harvard Annex. And in 1894, 15 years later, with the lobbying and hard work of many at the Annex, the Harvard Annex was chartered by the Commonwealth. The Harvard Annex was chartered as Radcliffe College by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. One big result, Annex women had earned a certificate. Radcliffe women now earned a diploma, a Radcliffe diploma, no Harvard diploma for women until 1963. And one other turning point came in World War II. 1943 was the beginning of what was called joint education, as Harvard and Radcliffe classes were combined mostly in response to the World War II. Until then, Harvard professors had come to the Radcliffe Yard to give separate lectures for women students. And we will talk some more about separate education with Evelyn from the class of 1941 and joint education with Mimi from the class of 1946. Okay, I will now turn to Julie Cheever to tell the history of our project and a little more about the history of Radcliffe.
Hi, everyone. So our project has been a volunteer project from the beginning, initiated by alumni. It started in a low-key, small-scale way and has grown to be quite large. One reason for this growth has been a tremendous interest and support by alumni around the country who want to preserve the history of Radcliffe. As we've talked to fellow alumni, we've learned that many women graduates, including those who fully support coeducation, are concerned that the history of Radcliffe seems to be disappearing from public conversation at Harvard, and to some extent from institutional memory at the university. So these oral histories are a way of helping to preserve the somewhat unusual history of Radcliffe. We think they also contribute to the broader history of higher education for women. The project focuses on alumni from the classes of the 1940s through the 1970s. It starts with the oldest alumni we were able to interview from the 1940s. At that point, Radcliffe had a separate administration, separate dormitories, and women tended to feel very loyal to Radcliffe and feel the bond of community and friendship, as you'll see from the interview excerpts. This starting point is also about the time of the beginning of the joint education in 1943 that Alice mentioned. We were able to interview a couple of alumni who were at Radcliffe before or during the transition to coeducation, but in the project in general, most of the oral histories will be from the time of coeducation. I mentioned the unusual history of Radcliffe. Although classes were combined in the mid-1940s, Radcliffe women were subject to a quota of a 4-to-1 ratio of men to women for nearly 3 more decades. Finally, in the 1970s, the quota was at first loosened slightly and then abolished in 1977, although it took a few more years to reach gender parity among undergraduates. The gender integration of dormitories and increased consolidation of administration also began in the 1970s. We are ending our project with the class of 1979 because the class of 1980 was the first class to be admitted by a combined Harvard-Radcliffe admissions office. Thus, the experiences of undergraduates that we'll hear about in this project will be set against the evolution of Radcliffe College up to its near disappearance at the end of the 1970s. And these experiences will also be set against the history of the time from World War II through the events and cultural changes of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, to get back to the history of our project, the inspiration came from a meeting of the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco 2 years ago in the spring of 2019. This club happens to be the only remaining independent Radcliffe club in the world, as opposed to a joint Harvard-Radcliffe club. At this meeting, Alice found herself sitting next to some interesting women from the classes of the 1950s and started wondering about what their experiences at Radcliffe were like. That summer and fall, a group of 4 of us started meeting to talk about how we could conduct interviews to record the histories of some of the older alumni. We met several times in San Francisco and Berkeley, and at first didn't even call ourselves a committee. The group included Alice and myself from the class of 1966, Pat Bourne from the class of 1961, another reunion class this year, and Randy Milden from the class of 1973. We developed a mission statement and a prototype of an interview guide, which has since been refined several times, and we tested the guide by interviewing each other. One decision that we made was that we wanted the interviews to focus on the undergraduate college experience of the alumni, rather than what they did later in life. Another decision was to make the older alumni the top priority. That led to phase 1 of the project, which we'll talk about today, being alumni from the classes of the 1940s through 1962. Phase 2 will be the rest of the 60s and the 70s. We figured out that Radcliffe history is kept at the Radcliffe College Archives at Harvard's Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America. This library is now considered one of the leading women's history libraries in the nation, and it is now housed in our former and now renovated Radcliffe Library building in the Radcliffe Yard. So it seems very apt that Radcliffe history is in a leading women's history library in our former library building. Alice then really picked up the ball and made contact with the Schlesinger Library and was able to visit the library in October 2019. She found that the Radcliffe College archives have a lot of documents such as reports and handbooks, but she was told that there was almost no history of the lived experience of Radcliffe undergraduates for the second half of the 20th century. And the librarians welcomed the idea of these oral histories. We decided to apply for a Schlesinger Library oral history grant, and Alice worked with an oral history expert to learn the procedures that meet a library's archival standards. The next spring, in April 2020, we received one of the library's 4 oral history grant awards, and we have been working closely with the Schlesinger librarians ever since. But now back in the fall of 2019, the next step in the growth of the project was that in November 2019, the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco awarded the project a grant of seed money. Now, I've mentioned that Alice, as the project director, and the interviewers are all alumni volunteers, but there are some ongoing expenses. The professional transcripts of the interviews that meet archival standards cost about $300 each. There are also printing, mailing, and administrative expenses. The Radcliffe Club seed money paid for these costs for the first few interviews and also for the important consultation with the oral history expert that got us started. The interviews finally began in January 2020. Alice, who was the first interviewer, was able to conduct 4 in-person interviews of San Francisco Bay Area alumni. But then the pandemic hit, and Alice and the other interviewers who later joined had to figure out how to conduct the interviews by Zoom or teleconference. But the good thing about that virtual technology was that the project was able to expand to gathering histories of alumni all over the country and even overseas. So that's how the project began. I'll now turn it over to Alice, Connie, and Diane to explain how the interviews work and give some examples of what the alumni told us. Thanks. Hi, everyone.
Oh, okay. Oh, I heard. Okay, so I'm going to describe a little bit more of the history. Just the interview, I want you all to see that it's really undergraduate life, Radcliffe life, academic life, and then a retrospective view. Have the women look back on who they were, their later life, from the later life to look back. I mean, sorry, a little confused there. The main thing is I want you to know that we do 1 long or 2 interviews for the alumni. If we do 2 in between the interviews, we find the women often remember details, feelings, even conversations from their Cambridge years. This is important. And if we complete it in 1 session, we offer a second time so that the interviewee can add any thoughts or feelings and/or memories. And the next slide, a little bit more about phase 1 and phase 2. So the next slide, Liz, there, thanks. And so the reason we stopped at 62 is it was the last class to receive a separate Radcliffe diploma. We find these women by word of mouth. It's formally called snowball sampling. I call it the Old Girls Network. Our intention is to preserve history that might be lost. Therefore, we're starting with our eldest alumni. And phase 2 goes to 79 because 79, that class was the very last class that was admitted by a separate Radcliffe College admissions. And the next slide, the update, is just to give you a picture of where we are today. We've done, actually, we wrote 55, but we're almost at 60 alums, and you can see the distribution. We have 1 wonderful alumna from 41, and we have at least 1 from almost every other class from 45 to 62. And if any of you know anybody in 47 or 54, please have them contact me. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have had 8 volunteer interviewers. And there on the left is what we call the booklet. We send that to each alum. Inside is their transcription. Okay, I think the next slide. And so in the next sections today, Connie, Diane, and I are going to present stories and quotes from our interviews. And it's been a challenge to select what to share in the time we have today. We hope you'll enjoy the highlights we have chosen. I'm going to start with the 40s, there's that slide, and then talk about diversity. Connie will follow with some themes from the 50s, and there'll be a change of pace for a flash mob event. You will hear why I said to remember the name Harvard Annex. And finally, Diane will present her findings while giving you an idea about some questions in the interview guide. Okay, yeah, I think go back to the other slides, Liz, the slide 7 still. I've interviewed 7 of the 10 alums from the 40s. And as we know, World War II defines it. Stay on this slide for a little bit more because I want to start with Louise, the class of 49. The reason I'm starting with her is she was the first woman I interviewed in January of 2020. In her home in San Francisco, sitting kitty corner at the dining room table. I had all my supplies with me. And I phoned her to ask if she would like to participate. And here was her answer on the phone. Alice, dear, I would love to help you, but the only thing I remember about Radcliffe is the smoking room in Cabot Hall. Okay, I said, let's start there. And guess what? They smoked and smoked and smoked, and they played bridge, and made lifelong friends. Louise was very matter of fact. People ask where I went to college, she said. I went to an institution that doesn't exist anymore called Radcliffe. It's now part of Harvard. At some point, Harvard wrote her to say she was actually entitled to a Harvard diploma. I said I was perfectly happy with what I had, she said. Sadly, Louise died 6 weeks after that interview, not from the pandemic. And as I mentioned, I make that booklet into a copy, with a copy of the transcription. She died before the booklet was completed. Her children and grandchildren were so happy to receive it. And I felt, gosh, it made all the difference to her family. This makes it all worth it, I felt. Her death supports our sense of urgency to give interested alums from these years a chance to tell their stories. The alumni from the 1940s are in their 90s, and the youngest alum is about 80. Okay, now next slide. Here's Evelyn, the class of 1941. In 2019, she went with her son to the commencement, and she was the eldest alum there from both Harvard and Radcliffe. Her 100th birthday is June 3rd. I interviewed her when she was about to be 99. She was a commuter all 4 years, and there were more commuters than residents at Radcliffe in those years, and they all gathered in Agassiz. And those were her people. She said she didn't really know many people from the quad. As far as she was concerned, equal education. We got the identical education they got at Harvard. That's when the professors walked across the commons to give them the same lectures they had just given to the men. She thought the merger was fine because actually, she said, we had a Harvard education, but we went to Radcliffe. So now you go to Harvard. And she also talked about Radcliffe, the diploma opening doors. She graduated and Pearl Harbor happened, and she was postponed graduate school to work at MIT to help organize a radiation lab at MIT. And she was very proud of that work. And this is what she said about getting that job. I think a Radcliffe diploma was important. I think it was very status. People knew that Radcliffe was the women's college of Harvard. You had to be specially bright to be admitted. And every place I applied for a job, they just automatically would assume I am smart. And I've heard that from other women in the 40s, women who got jobs that they hadn't even trained for because they went to Radcliffe. Okay, next slide. There are two women that were there during the war. This is Joan, even though it's spelled Joan. She was a World War II student, and she had decades of service to the college. She got the Radcliffe Distinguished Service Award in 1995. She loved Radcliffe. It was a very happy time. She loved history. She said, I've never gotten over it. To this day, I read history books. It was a separate world. She said when I was at Radcliffe, it was our world. Our friends, our world was really the Radcliffe yard. The close friends I have who are still living were mostly from my freshman year at Radcliffe. Now, while she was there, many Radcliffe students were crowded out by the military when the Waves set up headquarters at Briggs Hall and I think also Whitman. The Waves marched in the quad. They did calisthenics at 6 a.m. And they also recruited from Radcliffe and other Seven Sisters colleges women for special training. Now, Joanne wasn't able to use Zoom, so we did what's called free conference call. When you call up, you call the same number, and then I pressed all the buttons to start recording. And I always ask women at the end of an interview, if you think of something I didn't ask, let me know, things like that. And at the very beginning of the third phone interview, she was eager. She immediately got on, Alice, you forgot to ask me what I did in the Waves. And I said, wait, let me start to record, press the buttons. Okay, I'm recording now. Joanne, tell me, what did you do in the Waves? Her response, well, I can't tell you because it was top secret. We both enjoyed that moment, and Joanne was deservedly proud of her service and was in the Naval Reserves for 20 years. And finally, the last person was the class is Mimi. Next slide, the class of 1946. So as I mentioned earlier, 43 was the beginning of what was called joint education. And before, the professors were paid separately by Radcliffe, like they had a separate gig, really. And it was extra income for them, the ones who chose to teach. With joint education, the professors were now paid by Harvard, and Radcliffe gave them a lot of tuition money, I don't know what percent. And they were obliged to teach joint classes if their department so decided. This arrangement was intended as temporary, but it wasn't until 47 that it became actually an established policy. So Mimi describes a bumpy start of joint education. Okay, the audio.
We were very much aware of was the fact that our status at Harvard was changing due to the war. That we actually were going to classes in Harvard Yard,
Right.
and that a lot of the faculty were pretty hostile to that idea. I mean, there were faculty members who were notorious for making the women feel uncomfortable in their classes. It was known which professors were nice to women students, because you know, their male preserve was being invaded for the first time. I didn't have a really negative view of Harvard at all but when I was taking classes at Harvard. You know, people would say, "Well, watch out for this professor. He hates women." And you get in his class, you know, be careful, and so on, so on, so on. There was all that gossip around who did what. But I found some professors who were very supportive. I mean, I certainly had one wonderful tutor, and you just kind of, you rolled with those punches. There was other stuff going on.
Yes, other stuff going on, World War II. And during the war, there were thousands of men in what were called service academies going through all year in school, then going into the armed services. And after the war, they called it the Great Return, which is all the GI Bills made it possible for lots of people to come back to Harvard. And I was told by others who were in college in these post-war years of the late 40s that there were just many, many men. And Mimi entered in 42. I don't know if Mimi's here, but if you are, hello. And they had an opinion about what it was like to be, Mimi had an opinion about what it was like to be a female undergraduate in what she called a sea of men. Okay, audio.
Well, the Harvard undergraduate experience was very different from very much aware of any other time was the fact that our status at Harvard was changing. They were all due to the service academies. So,
okay.
Well, the Harvard undergraduate experience was very different from what it was at any other time in history, because there were thousands of them, and they were all in service academies. So I mean, so to me, coming from a girls' high school, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven.
Okay. So the next slide is about diversity. So those are just 4 snapshots of interviews with alums from the 40s and from the 40s. And now, before we move on to Connie and Diane's interviews with alums from the 50s and early 60s, I want to say a few words about what we found out about diversity in this phase 1 of the project. That is, during the time period from the 40s through the 60s, in the early 60s. In those decades, there was very little, many will say no, racial and ethnic diversity. For a lot of the women in this phase, undergraduate diversity meant public or private school, commuter or dorm, religion, different majors, cultural knowledge like music and art, and some noticing of class and some geography. And from today's knowledge and growing understanding of inclusion, diversity, and racism, the women all express and realize how unaware they were about the lack of racial diversity. And I want to tell you something about Jewelle from the class of 1955. We always ask the alumni in our interview in the retrospective section, looking back, what was the best and the worst? In other words, the positives and the negatives about their Radcliffe experience. Jewelle thrived at Radcliffe. She was very politically active and feels like she expanded her knowledge and interests greatly. She loved, she was a class officer all 4 years. And she said, I made some very close friends that have been lifelong friends, and they are all white. And that was good to have friends across racial barriers. When Jewelle arrived in 1951, she was one of 7 Black women at Radcliffe, she said. And she was the only Black student in the class of 1955. And next slide. So what were the negatives, I said to Jewelle. When she entered in 51, they assigned roommates by race and religion. Jewelle's words are, the biggest negative was the problem of the roommates being segregated. She was assigned a Black roommate in Morris Hall, and that roommate never showed, so Jewelle became the only Black woman in her class. The segregated roommate policy was something she and others formally objected to and helped organize to get change. It took a couple years, but they did change it. And her other negative is mainly the lack of good career counseling. And so here's another question we ask all the women. Did you speak up in class? It wasn't unusual for women to not talk in class. Why? Well, many reasons, but the ratio of men and women, women's comments were ignored. They would say something and then it would get ignored, and then the men would say the same thing and they got the attention. And they weren't called upon, and some were just shy, they said. So here is what Jewelle said to me when I asked her if she spoke up in class.
And
Okay.
did you speak up? I'm sure you did, but I have to.
Yeah, I did. See, I was never shy like that.
Yeah.
And Alice, if you know anything about the culture of black women are known to be more assertive than white
yeah,
women.
especially the Cliffies, I imagine. But I get it.
Well, no,
yeah.
no. In our culture, women have often
You think
had
in the
to-
culture, yeah.
Oh yeah, it is
Okay.
a cultural trait. They've had to carry the burden while men were treated so badly, didn't have jobs, went to prison,
Uh-huh.
etc. So women
Yeah.
are more, black women are speak up. They're more assertive.
Okay.
We're not shy.
Okay, thank you, Jewelle, for correcting me there. And one update from the 60s, Marion Bennett, who I hope is here from our class of 1966, we were talking, and she said our class was the breakthrough class. And I said, well, how? And she said there were 8 of us. 8 of us black women. And I said, that's a breakthrough? And she said, instead of 1. When Marion entered in all of our class, the reunion class of 66, when we entered in 62, there was 1 black woman per class in the sophomore, junior, and senior class. Okay. Next slide. So now we're finally getting to the 50s and early 60s. I'll turn it to Connie and Diane to tell us what they learned from their interviews. And in between, we will have the Lamont Library flash mob. Okay, Connie, you're on.
Okay, excuse me. My voice is a little bad, but we need the next slide. So do you want to have the next slide? Okay, so I've interviewed about a dozen wonderful women between the classes of 1953 and 62. And in general, their memories of their time at Radcliffe are positive, but these are women of the particular to that time when it no longer felt like enough just to be an educated woman. So I want to start with a clip from Mary, the class of 58. She was a biology major interested in forestry, but someone in the bio department told her that she couldn't or shouldn't go into forestry because women couldn't do field work. Never mind. I mean, it's so awful. Anyway, after she graduated, she had a dream about Radcliffe that recurred for 5 or 6 years. So listen to her describe her dream. The audio.
Radcliffe, and I was trying to find a room where I was going to have a class, and I couldn't find it, and I just had a terrible time finding it. And I can't really remember what happened. I think when I did find it, it was the wrong one. As I look back on it, I think maybe it was because I thought I was going to find something about life that I hadn't found.
Maybe what she was looking for was the opportunity to go into forestry, or at least feel supported in following her interests. Another woman I spoke to saw her situation as a dilemma. She sent me a poem she had written maybe 5 years after she graduated. And I wish I had time to read the poem to you, but I don't. What Nona said about her poem was that the poem speaks to that period when I didn't quite know what to do about having this amazing introduction to amazing ideas. How do you act upon that? So Catherine, a graduate of 1959, zeroed in on what she thinks these women were missing. This oral history, she said, is looking at what women were like between the classes of 1945 and 60 or 65, about women emerging from the kind of lives that our mothers and grandmothers had into the kind of professional lives that our daughters and granddaughters have. We were kind of right in the middle of that. Like many others, her career as a family therapist didn't start until well after she graduated. In fact, one woman even referred to herself as a flounderer because it took her 10 years to figure out what she wanted to do. And she did become very distinguished, just she started late. Perhaps that's why one alumna, Margaret Elizabeth, noted that her classmates had become more friendly and easygoing at their reunions. She said many had blossomed in the 70s and started professional careers formerly inaccessible to women. So next slide. So along with restricted career choice, some of the alumni I interviewed commented on the sexual pressure they felt. It's hard to remember, but this was the era before the pill and before Roe v. Wade. In fact, the university wouldn't prescribe contraceptives unless you were married. So you can imagine what an impact that had on their lives. So listen to what one graduate of the class of 59 said. She started at Radcliffe as a 16-year-old. She was very popular and was overwhelmed by the attention of all the men. They were calling her, leaving messages for her, waiting for her after class. She thought there were too many men around. She said it wasn't sexual harassment, but it was sexual pressure. I mean, I can still remember a well-known poet today holding my hand in the Radcliffe quad and trying to explain to me that unless I slept with him, I wouldn't understand what life was all about. I mean, I wasn't old enough to deal with that. In fact, she was so uncomfortable that she was driven away and took a year off. But I think Dorothy really puts her finger on the issue. Listen carefully to Dorothy. She said, I think we all felt we had a limited amount of time we could get away with being single. The pressure on sex was too great and the risk was too great. And you better make up your mind and get married. This from a woman who was accepted into Harvard Graduate School, but then was unable to go because she was pregnant. In fact, at least 3 of the women I interviewed were married before they graduated. One even joked that she was the last of her group of friends to get married, and she got married 3 whole weeks after graduation. Listen to Minna, class of 62, who stopped me in the middle of our interview because we hadn't broached the subject of sex. Minna said, we were late adolescents, and one of the tasks of adolescence is discovering and learning to manage our sexuality. And that took a huge amount of emotional and mental energy. Although officially it was never mentioned, no guidance, no talking about it, that's all we talked about. I'm exaggerating, she said. It's not all we talked about, but it was a major topic. So those are just 2 of the themes that arose while I was interviewing all these lovely alumni. There are many others, but I want to end with a paradox because life, undergraduate life, as I said, it's complicated. So I want you to listen to Sally, who is a graduate of the class of 58, who became a published author of novels, memoirs, biographies, and more. She wanted to join the Harvard Advocate Board. So listen to her. Audio.
But can you believe it? In those days, they gave you something to study. And I think it was the wasteland. I'm not certain it was that, but I think it was that or something equally intimidating. And then you went and sat in the advocate office at a long table. And to my memory, it was dark. And they had a sort of spotlight on you at the head of the table. And they began to fire these incredibly difficult questions to you about the wasteland and the interpretation of the wasteland. And I was just not able to cope with it at all. And I remember finally just really breaking down crying. I couldn't deal with it at all. And needless to say, I didn't get on the board. Later, I learned that that was probably fortunate because what the Radcliffe girls did was clean the bathroom.
Ironically, Although these arrogant young men didn't want Sally on their board, they did publish short stories of hers, one of which won a prize and went on to be published in anthologies. So, although it wasn't always easy to be a Radcliffe girl at Harvard, I want to end with Alice Mary, who sums up how so many of the women I talked to felt about their time at Radcliffe. She said, "I consider my 4 years at Cambridge among the happiest in my life. I'm grateful for the exhilaration of the classroom, the excitement of the theater, and the many friends with whom I still feel a special kinship." So this now to Alice.
Okay. Okay, our flash mob. If some of you can read the slide, in the class of 1953 at their 50th reunion, arranged to attend a cocktail party at Lamont, which they could finally get into. It was Lamont opened in 49 and women weren't admitted until 67. And they made a conspicuous show of study and then burst into song. It was called the Radcliffe Revolution Song. And remember the Harvard Annex, when you hear the song being sung, it's a clip from my interview with Winnie Blacklow from the class of 58. Okay. Is this a time, do you want to sing that song, or the one, from the 1953? What verses? Remember, I can't remember.
You had the verse that said there will be a ladies' restroom in the basement of Lamont when the Radcliffe Revolution comes. Yeah. Harvard then will be the annex. Harvard then will be the annex. Harvard then will be the annex when the Radcliffe Revolution comes. We will put Dean Kirby Miller into Massachusetts Hall. We will put Dean Kirby Miller into Massachusetts Hall. We will put Dean Kirby Miller into Massachusetts Hall when the Radcliffe Revolution comes. Harvard then will be the annex. I love that song. It won the song contest a few years before I arrived, but we sang it every year.
Thank you, Winnie. That was fabulous. And if anybody knows somebody who was in the flash mob, class of 53, or if you were there, please contact me. Put the information in the chat. Thank you. So next, Diane can give you a glimpse into our interview topics as she shares her findings. Okay.
Hi. So that's a hard act to follow, but what I'd like to do is talk about my interviews and talk about them in a little bit of a different way from Alice and Connie by talking about some of the categories of the interview guide we used and the themes that emerged in each category. Just to be clear, these are highlights, not the complete picture, but they should give you some idea of the kinds of things we heard. One part of our interview focused on academics. We asked each woman about her academic experiences at Radcliffe. Although their answers varied, there were some consistent themes. Most of the women arrived at Radcliffe with a great sense of possibilities and opportunities. When they were there, they found that they got little to no academic guidance or any kind of guidance about a post-Radcliffe future. They were left to their own devices. They also found that outside of class, they had little contact with professors. Even though over time, the women realized that their experience in this regard was different from that of the Harvard students, most women just accepted this. And finally, there was much exposure to new ideas through classes, friendships, and extracurricular activities. Next slide, please. Next, we asked about life as a Radcliffe student. Again, there were some consistent themes that emerged. There was a general acceptance of rules about parietal hours, clothing, and drinking. And there were many rules. There was acceptance of having to go back and forth between Radcliffe and Harvard several times a day in all weather, and there was little questioning about the fairness of this arrangement. During this time, the women that I interviewed were in the 50s and 60s. There was minimal participation in or awareness of political issues or activities. Dating was very important to these women, and it took up a lot of time, sometimes more time than studying took. Most of the women I interviewed had found future husbands by the end of their senior year. There was little awareness or experience of sexual harassment, though a high and surprising tolerance for activities of peeping toms or men who got into the dorms at night. This was one of the most surprising findings to me. And there were lots of topics that were unspoken and not discussed with other students. These included diversity, sexuality, abortions, sexual harassment, sexual preference, politics. All of this began to change at the beginning of the 1960s. Next slide, please. In another section of the guide, we asked the women how their experiences at Radcliffe connected to their future. The themes that emerged here were an assumption that they would marry early and have children right away. Many of the women thought they would have careers or jobs, but they didn't know what they would be. Eventually, everyone I interviewed had careers. The 50s women had careers in traditional women's fields, while the early 60s women tended to branch out a bit. Radcliffe clearly shaped the lives of these women through the people they met and the opportunities these relationships and friendships provided. It shaped their lives by providing a credential that opened doors of many kinds throughout their lives. And finally, it shaped their lives through the lifelong friendships they made at Radcliffe. Next slide. We ended our interview with a retrospective look at the Radcliffe experience. For many people, the best aspects of Radcliffe were friends, excitement, feelings of freedom, stimulation, a sense of self-confidence, and a feeling of being among the best. That said, many criticized the education that Radcliffe provided them. They felt that there was too much sheer absorption of information and not enough critical thinking. Many thought the education they received was not rigorous or broad, and some felt that it was disorganized. For everyone I interviewed, the merger with Harvard was seen as a negative. It was seen as a loss of Radcliffe's identity and the feelings of being part of a team. Next slide, please. But whatever their criticisms or concerns about their education, in the end, everyone I talked with was glad she had gone to Radcliffe and grateful for everything that experience brought to her life. These many voices can be summed up by a quote from Jill, one of the women I interviewed. Audio, please.
Well, I've cast aspersions at Radcliffe in different ways. So I guess I'd like to wind up by saying thank you, Radcliffe. It was a good experience. It was the most exciting world to be in. It was really quite a privilege.
Alice, I think you're next.
Yeah. Okay, what's next? Well, we plan to finish phase 1 by the fall. And there's a tremendous potential for this project, and we look forward to launching phase 2 to make this a complete document of the living history of Radcliffe undergraduates. As I have said, phase 1 reflects the urgency to get started, and phase 2 can make it complete. And as you can read on the slide, we have 2 big challenges for phase 2. We have to find and identify a broad and diverse sampling of the class. We don't want to just do word of mouth because it's a much larger pool of alums. It's more diverse, and there's more people available to participate. And the second is to conduct fundraising in a formal way to support the effort. We do have our volunteer alumni interviewers, and we will need to pay for the kinds of things Julie mentioned: professional transcribing, research consultation, and additional administrative help. Okay, next slide. I would like to end with some personal reflections. I started out 2 years ago at the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco, sitting in the living room of Julie Cheever, looking around there were about maybe 15 of us. And I thought, why did we all decide to join the Radcliffe, the separate Radcliffe Club? Then I looked around at the older alums and I thought, and I was feeling really simply curious. What was their Radcliffe like? Then, on my visit to the Schlesinger in the fall of 2019, a librarian told me, basically, she said, there is little or no record in the Schlesinger Library of the undergraduate lived experience of Radcliffe women for the second half of the 20th century. I think my stunned response was something profound like, you've got to be kidding me. Knowing about this absence of recorded history certainly moved me beyond just curiosity, and it motivated our San Francisco Club committee to make this project a reality. And here we are today, 55 plus interviews later. We have met and spoken to these vibrant, articulate women who are engaged in remembering and sharing their experiences. The alumni appreciate and express gratitude for these conversations. Lucille Postkanzer, member of the San Francisco Club of San Francisco, the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco, class of 55. I interviewed her, I think that she was my third interview, so I got to go to her house. And she told the Harvard magazine that her oral history interview was the first time someone had expressed interest in her Radcliffe experience. We alumni have a story to tell our time in Cambridge. I've often asked myself, what is it about the Oral History Project that captures the imagination and enthusiasm of almost every Radcliffe alumna that hears about the project? And thank you, Minna Schrag and Mary Cimetti from the class of 62 for helping me think about this question. The alumni look back on their younger selves and the choices they made as undergraduates. They can reflect on the lifelong impact of their undergraduate Radcliffe life. What did they accept as normal that now seems unacceptable? What were the ways that attending Radcliffe was an exceptional and singular experience? Everyone realizes that these oral histories are not only an opportunity to remember. As Julie reminded us earlier, many alumni think the history of Radcliffe College itself has disappeared from the public conversation and from institutional memory at Harvard and at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. The alumni know that their oral histories are an essential contribution to history, the history of coeducation at Radcliffe with Harvard, the history of Radcliffe College as a separate women's college, and of course, a contribution to the broader history of women in higher education in America. In conclusion, please know that these interviews mean so much to the alumni being interviewed. And they mean so much to those of us doing the interviews. I love meeting these women, and I love doing these interviews. The interviews are a shared experience. It makes a difference to the alumni in many ways, all as members of a particular community of women, the alumni of Radcliffe College. And thank you all for listening today. Thank you, the Radcliffe Club of San Francisco. Thank you, Julie Cheever, for all your brilliant work and support. And to Connie Gibb and Diane Franklin, thank you for your skillful interviewing and enormous commitment to this project. And I see she put the next slide up. Contact us. Different ways to contact us. There's the Gmail for the project, and you can get more information on radcliffehistory.org. And I just want to say, if any alumni that are listening from the early phase one, I'd like to hear from you right away if you have interest in participating. And any flash mobbers or people from 1953, where are you and who are you? Please contact me. And of course, all those from the 60s and 70s, I am keeping a file. You know, anyone not here today, please tell them about it, and we can discuss. And remember to look for that. There's an article, I didn't mention it exactly when I mentioned Lucille. Lucille, the Harvard magazine is writing an article about the alumni, the Oral History Project, in the very next issue, the July-August issue, in the alumni section.